Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about architecture and the climate crisis. I am joined today by Daniel A. Barber. Daniel is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also chairs the PhD program. Daniel describes his research as centered around two primary tracks, the first being what he calls the, quote, revisionist history of architecture modernism as it relates to environmental concerns. And the second is about providing a framework for architects and designers to engage with the climate crisis. Both of these research interests are present in his completely fascinating new book, Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning. This book, which came out last summer, looks at how 20th century architects incorporated climate-mediating strategies into their designs before the invention and popularity of air conditioning and HVAC units. What this book shows, though, is that the architect's role in mediating climate, in controlling climate, in creating conditions for comfort, and thinking about the use of fossil fuels has largely been usurped by the engineer, and that the invention of air conditioning profoundly shaped the trajectory of modern architecture. This book is an incredible piece of research, an incredible piece of design history, and it got me thinking about all sorts of things. It's also a book that's very relevant to the graphic designer, which you'll hear us talk about in the second half of this episode. We also talk about how he found his way into architecture through his environmental interests. We talk about his long-term research on environmental conditions and this idea that air conditioning is also a type of people conditioning, which was this really kind of profound insight that I thought he had in the book. It's a great conversation that I hope you enjoy as much as I did. Don't forget, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listener support. If you enjoy the show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I like to think of as the director's commentary for the show, including reflections on the episodes, a preview of upcoming shows, and all sorts of other bonus content. If you want to help the show and see it continue, I hope you consider becoming a member. You can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members for all the details. Thanks again for listening, and here is my conversation with Daniel Barber. I would like to talk about your new book, or newish book, Modern Architecture and Climate. But before we get into that, I want to actually step back and kind of put this book kind of into context of your larger research and larger thinking, kind of larger intellectual life, because your previous book, this book is about architecture and air conditioning. Your previous book was about modern architecture and solar energy. And a lot of your work is kind of thinking about alternative histories or revisionist histories, I've heard you refer to it, around architecture and climate. Where did that interest come from for you, or how did you kind of get involved in this subject?
I mean, I kind of came to the field of architecture somewhat naively, circa 2000. My father was an architect, so I'd kind of been around architecture, or is an architect, I should say. I've been around architecture my whole life, and I grew up in Colorado, and he was designing houses and offices and all sorts of things around southern Colorado. But I entered into, I came from a theoretical background through my college work at University of Washington, and a kind of strong, basically post-structuralism training there, and thought I would turn to architecture to think about the environment, and assumed that there would be a robust, kind of exciting discussion going on. This was my naivete in circa 2000, and through various kind of random pathways and friends of friends, ended up looking at the Yale degree. They have a sort of what they call the Master of Environmental Design, which is not really necessarily about environment.
Right.
It's really just to kind of make your own fabulous kind of, explore theoretical dimensions of the field opportunity for scholars, for young scholars in training, I should say. I mean, it's often on the way to the PhD, as it was for me. So I went to that program, again, kind of assuming I was going to be kind of walking into this discussion, and found that, there were many people interested in having a discussion, but it certainly wasn't the sort of primary set of issues. So immediately came to kind of, face the question, okay, why is this happening, right? I mean, what is at stake that there's such a, I mean, you come from sort of outside of architecture at any moment in the past kind of 20 years, and there's so much discussion around efficiencies and technologies and ways of engaging with environmental problems. And you go kind of deep into the architectural discourse, and it's just not, I mean, it is a little bit now, I should say. Things have changed dramatically, but, circa 2000 was, 2003 was just not there, right? So looking at that question, and then so of course this becomes an archival question, and I kind of slowly went back into the archive. I wrote a bit about the 60s in Berkeley, and about how environmental design was formulated. That was my thesis work at Yale, and then went into the PhD program at Columbia, in effect, just to sort of keep digging in the archive to think about how these histories had, both the kind of histories of what the books try to do, both books in a way, is both tell the story of how these histories developed, right? How solar architecture
Right.
developed, how climate responsive architecture developed, in the context of why you haven't heard about it yet.
Right. Right.
What were
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
discursive obstacles? I mean, even Rainer Bannon, right, our favorite kind
Yeah.
of environmental, protagonist, has nothing to say about these projects, and that's an interesting set of questions, right? So that's
Yeah.
the kind of framing in both cases. Yeah, and I should just say, I mean, just sorry, but just to caveat all of that for a second, because I don't want to just sort of spread any despair about the kind of state of the architectural field. I mean, there's an amazing amount of fabulous work going on focused on the environment, but the discourse, has needed to be shifted, and I was in that moment 20 years ago quite surprised at what I found.
Right. And I have one, possibly two other questions kind of just about what you just said and about that story and kind of your entry into this. With your father being an architect, and you mentioned going to Yale as kind of thinking about it theoretically, were you oh, I'm not totally sure how to phrase this question. Were you interested in being a practicing architect, or were you interested in climate and the environment and you saw architecture as a way to kind
Yeah,
of
the
think about
second
that?
one, the second
Mm.
one, and again, really without, I mean, in somewhat, kind of at the psychoanalytic level, right? Like not really thinking about how this was going to change my relationship
Right.
with my father, right? But no, but yeah, not kind of recognizing all those dimensions, but also and I had an art background as well, right? So I had a
Mm.
kind of and a really and so the sort of theory, the kind of world I went through at the University of Washington was a kind of, it was called the Comparative History of Ideas, was the degree
Oh,
program, and it
interesting.
was a very, why I basically, again, I read Bataille for like 3 years. I mean, it was just this sort of swimming
Nice.
in post-structuralism,
Yeah.
and fabulous. I mean, great people that I'm still in close contact with, scholars around the world, um, and but really did go. I mean, in a way, it was kind of like, this is a world I'm familiar with. I mean, it felt really natural. It
Hmm.
didn't feel
Hmm.
like a decision in a way to me at the time. But as I sort of post hoc thought about it, this was a world I was familiar with, that I knew had, and growing up in Colorado, and even though my father was, is not a sort of radical green architect in any way, we grew up around solar
Okay.
houses and the kind of everydayness of the solar house, right? I mean, and they're
Right.
all over the place in the West, right? And whether how passive and active, to different degrees, but there's an approach that is very solar, so to speak, and certainly the kind of modernism of the late 70s and 80s, the kind of, well, late, not even modernism, but the kind of late, the kind of weirdly angled solar houses in Colorado in that period were very noticeable in the suburban landscape,
Mm.
right? So
I
so
see.
these were
Yeah.
around, right? And I,
Right.
so just to say that the sort of my milieu had some sense of a kind of relationship of architecture and the environment that was just sort of there, and so right, I came into the field thinking this is a place where sort of climate and ideas about, I mean, I'd always been an environmentalist, and always been,
Mm.
again,
Okay.
growing up in Colorado, I mean, always had been
Right.
sort of, this
Right.
was my thing. And the art that I had made is getting my MFA, which was kind of on the way to all these things too, in various ways, was very
Yeah.
much kind of observing cities and observing landscapes and kind of understanding these forms of interaction, and trying to kind of map
I see.
infrastructures in various ways. And so, yeah, this had been my kind of realm, um, but
I see.
wanted to kind of understand, in a sense, pretty soon after getting at Yale, yeah, sort of, why haven't we been talking? Why hasn't the discourse been preoccupied with environment more
I
in
see.
more productive ways. Yeah.
That's interesting. I wanted to, if we had time, I was going to ask you. I was trying to chart your path in my research and saw that you were
Mm.
in Washington and then the MFA and then you were at
Mm.
Yale. And so, kind of hearing that, they actually obviously that some of this is also revisionist, but they sound very related, or that there's clearly
Mm.
some interests that are connecting them all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so let's talk about modern architecture and climate. Let's talk about your new
Yeah.
book, because
Yeah.
I think, in a way, hearing you kind of talk about that background, a lot of what you're saying, I see in the book when I was reading it. And what's I'm going to kind of paraphrase something that I thought was a big idea in the book, and then I'd like to hear you kind of talk about how you think about the book and your goal for the
Sure.
book. But what was really interesting to me, as someone who's not an architect, who's just a lover of architecture, likes reading about architecture, talks to a lot of architects and kind of architecture theorists, is that before that, air conditioning, the idea of HVAC units, actually had a fairly profound shift in both the aesthetics and look of buildings, but also in the kind of domain of the architect. And that pre air conditioning, the control of the climate inside a building was something that an architect thought about. And then with air conditioning, that left the architect and went to the engineer. And I found that shift very interesting, and
Hmm.
I felt like that kind of subtly came up again and again in the book.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah. Yeah.
talk about kind of what it was about air conditioning, what it is about HVAC that became this kind of crux that you could kind of then build this entire book around?
Yeah. Yeah. No, good. That's a nice way to frame it. And, no, and it was that shift, and it's funny because I think in the book, and even now, there's just these kind of layers of kind of backs and forths of kind of the the trajectories of kind of history and cause and effect that kind of swirl around in the book a little bit, and they kind of swirl around AC in that sense. Um, because I think, just as you suggest, that what the book tells the story of, in fact, is the sort of architectural experiments and projects and buildings and designs before air conditioning sort of emerged as an economically viable, as a kind of energy system viable process. And in fact, it tells the story, frankly, of many buildings built in the 30s and 40s without air conditioning, and that use design as a mechanism, as a means, as a process to sort of manage a relationship to climate. But just to say that many of those buildings were later air conditioned, right? I mean, often through very
Right.
ugly
Right.
window units, right? And so air conditioning has certainly taken over, and that's always in the that we can't kind of lose sight of that, and certainly the architects in the 30s had no idea of. And they're but what we so the issue is that, sort of post hoc, right? I mean, as we look back at it, we can see that the way that modernism was framed by some of its protagonists in the 30s, and I follow a kind of a clear sort of stream historiographically, right, from Le
Hmm.
Corbusier into Brazil, and Richard Neutra, and then kind of out into a broader, sort of global dispersion. But it's to say that it's a narrative that goes sort of thoroughly and kind of solidly within the framework of modern architecture as we understand it, right? And I basically argue and present evidence that I hope is convincing, that says that climate was a huge part of this discussion, and how, and in fact, that I mean, if you kind of think about, right, okay, steel, glass, and concrete, and here's this kind of design apparatus that can operate around the world in a different way, imagined it itself kind of through universal standards and international styles and this sort of thing. Um, you're talking about a capacity to sort of engage with a range of different climates with this kind of flexible system, right? So the way that I like to think about it is that the kind of modernism, as it was proposed in the 20s and 30s and into the early 60s, in this stream, was kind of really imagined as a kind of mechanism of climatic adaptability, right? So that the
Right.
building can sort of be inserted into the urban condition, and sort of adjust itself, right? And so shading devices and
Mm.
very complex shading screens and multiple shading devices on the facade, and very carefully keyed facades and orientation studies, and and a whole world of engagement. We can maybe get into it in question, but I mean, it goes on into this whole world of engagement with the kind of climate science. But in the early years of the sort of modern design questions in the first half of the book, really a focus on how these kind of tools of modernism become a means to sort of make a building flexible according to its sort of climatic needs, so that the conditions on the exterior are sort of adapted and make sense relative to the conditions. I'm sorry, so that the conditions on the interior are adapted to the changing patterns of the exterior, which of course those patterns themselves just kind of being known, right? I mean, the kind of climate science is developing at the same time. So you just sort of imagine these kind of circulations of knowledge that are trying to understand the thermal interior and the global climate, right? And the facade then, as I play out in the book, and the facade section and even becomes this sort of huge sort of space for me to to discuss these things, this kind of emblem, a kind of leitmotif that carries through the book to allow us to see the changes that are happening. Um, the
Right.
facade becomes this kind of space to negotiate, right, and to negotiate the
Right.
relationship between interior and exterior, etc.
Yeah, yeah. I have a question about that, and I'm not. I hope this is not reductive in any way, or making you kind of re-explain things in the book. But the idea of the facade was interesting to me, and kind of what you're just talking about of modernism in a way was kind of allowing these buildings to be placed in an urban environment and kind of adapt to the climate. And what's interesting that kind of comes through in your book is that, again, before air conditioning, architects were often thinking about the placement of the building in the landscape, where the sun came in,
Mm.
where the
Hmm.
trees were placed, what the
Hmm.
type of shading was happening to help control the interior climate.
Hmm.
How the introduction of air conditioning, how kind of moving
Right,
that domain from the
right.
architect to the engineer, how did that,
Hmm.
I guess the question maybe I'm asking
Sure.
is how architects kind of then changed the process, or how you see, these buildings being changed when
Yeah.
that no longer became a kind of way of thinking about the building.
I think it starts to get at one of these kind of shifts that we were already talking about in terms of the kind of complicated causes and effects and so on, which is that um, when and we'll speak very schematically about the kind of history of modernism in architecture, right? But it's to say that when this sort of break
Hmm.
occurs, which already that's a problem, right? But when the sort of moment of
Hmm.
modernization occurs, right, and we talk about we're going to different materials and a different sort of capacity to kind of operate technologically and kind of bureaucratically and even politically, arguably. As we begin to experiment with the different kind of array of materials of architectural modernism, um, um, you really start to see this shift in the discussion um, that. Sorry. Let me just put it this way: that the problem the problem. So you're breaking away from traditional patterns that manage climate. Let's just put it that way, right? That
Right,
over the
right.
centuries, over the millennia, architectural forms and materials, and the thickness of walls and the size of the window, and all of these issues have in some way been inflected according to the climate of the exterior. And that's been known either through tacit knowledge or in some cases theorized. I mean, kind of depending on how extreme the climate was, right, and how much of an issue it was. Um,
Hmm.
but what so in a way, what you say when you introduce the sort of tools and ideas and materials of modernism is a kind of step away from that traditional set of responses. Again, a claim to a universality, and then a set of questions of sort of, okay, well, so how does this manage climate, right? How does this adapt to these
Mm.
different climatic regimes? And then a kind of introduction, in effect, if you will, a reintroduction of a number of strategies from, let's say, that vernacular vocabulary in terms of shading mechanisms, in terms of wall thicknesses, in terms of facades, again, although formulated quite differently. Um, but a number of techniques and tools, the brise soleil, of course, the kind of famous
Right.
one, right? That kind of reintroduces again, right? These kind of means, I mean, that are taken from shading devices and veranda and screens and other sorts of systems that are existing in again pre-modern, let's say, vernacular practices for some centuries, right? So there's a kind of reintegration already at the beginning, right, of these kind of threads of uh, um, modernism and climate and this kind of responsiveness to these vernacular practices. Um,
Right.
and so there's a that shift that we're of how to think about the site again is a similar sort of model in the sense that the site was everything for architecture
Right.
for
Right.
ever. Right?
Right.
and,
Right. Right.
and 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 I mean there's this moment actually in the book where there's these two brothers, these Hungarian twins who are kind of climate methodologists, kind of
Yeah.
climate
Yeah.
designers, and they very much in the legacy of Le Corbusier as they see themselves. But um, they produced this ridiculous, fabulous, amazing machine called the thermoheliodon, which is this kind of domed kind of weather system to try to model the building's climatic interior. And it's a total mess. It just doesn't work. Um, yeah, it's kind of fabulous in its access. But what they do, they insist that in this system, in this thermoheliodon device, that you place soil from the site, right? I mean, the sense that kind of the earth, in which it's both kind of this intense phenomenological kind of sense of the earthness of the climatic system, right? That it relates to this kind of being in place, right? But it's also, I mean, that's part of what gets exceeded by computation, right? But then it also, um, just is so it has this romanticism to it that I think is also quite
Something that you write about in the book, hearing this is making me think of this kind of other trajectory that's happening in the book that you've written about elsewhere, which is this
mm,
question of comfort and
mm,
what it means to be comfortable. And I think both air conditioning and kind of pre-air conditioning, the situation on the site was a way to create comfort for the
yeah,
dweller inside the place. And
right,
something that you write in the book is that air conditioning is also people conditioning, which I thought
mm,
was such a
mm,
great
mm.
line. And I'm wondering if you could just talk more about this idea of comfort and how air conditioning has kind of reframed what we think of as comfortable, and how we can start to um, perhaps rethink or think about that in new ways in some way.
Yeah, no, I mean it's funny here because you're really again you're hitting on the great
Okay.
points, and
Good.
um, I think another one of the kind of, I mean, not a contradiction, but just the sort of pleasant complication of the book is that it, I mean, when you introduced it, you said that it was about architecture and air conditioning, and as
Mhm.
we authors do, we get so close to these things, right? And I kind of bristle because, of course, the whole premise is before air conditioning. But then on the other hand, of course, you're absolutely right that it is about I mean, it's about air conditioning the whole time, right? I mean, that's again part of the kind of problematic that's at stake is sort of posing this question of, did we always have air conditioning, right? Like, how have we existed without it, and how it's so completely changed our our kind of metric of comfort, right? Or of kind of what's acceptable in our interior. When I was talking about those buildings in Brazil a minute ago, um, with these incredibly dynamic shading devices. And I think I just to clarify that story for a second, that a number of buildings built in Brazil in the 40s and 50s with these wildly dynamic shading devices, often three and four or five different kind of
Right.
sets and levers and things to move around to control the
Hmm.
thermal and the daylight incidence. Many of those were just taken off and they were replaced with air conditioning units, right? Um,
Right.
uh, so really to recognize that, which helps us to see a lot of things, but one of the things that helps us to see is that the way that we want to experience an interior has transformed, right? And that what was maybe acceptable and sort of comfortable or
Hmm.
livable in 1945, right, as ASHRAE standards, basically, various air conditioning regulatory standards transformed over the decades, is kind of no longer comfortable, right? And so
Right.
there's just a real uh, shift, not a shift not only in not only in sort of what is provided and how we experience these interiors, but sort of what we expect and what we see to be. Because comfort, in effect, comfort is what's killing us, right? I mean, our comfort
Right.
equals
Right.
our civilizational demise, right? So we have to kind of
Right.
keep that in mind, right? And so we can, how do we how much less comfortable can we be? Is
Right.
becomes the kind of question for architects, basically, right? Yeah,
Right.
this kind of dynamic between, I guess it's also just to say, just to answer that in a slightly different way, that people often say, well, we'll never satisfy our current energy demand with renewable energy, right? So we
Mm.
have to continue using fossil fuels. But another way to have that discussion is to say we're never going to satisfy our current energy demand with renewable energy, so we have to change our current energy demand, right? And reduce
Right.
it, of course. And the built environment becomes a huge tool through which to do that, right? So just really, yeah,
Right.
kind of overplaying that as a kind of mechanism to operate differently, right? To live differently, to feel comfortable in different sorts of spaces, to want different things, want less stuff, right? I mean, there's a broader kind of consumerist argument that goes on as well.
You have a line in the book that I loved, and I'm paraphrasing it. So you wrote it much better than how I'm about to say it. But it's something to the effect of our drive for being comfort to control our internal climate, our interior climates, is what is then in turn harming the external climate. This proliferation of air conditioning is what's kind of causing so many
Yeah.
of these problems.
No, and it's totally it's true, right? And it's hard to, once you kind of see it, it's unavoidable, right? That yeah, I mean the relation, and then of course when you think about that line, not in the context of, most of us right now, I assume, are sitting in homes which are
Mhm, mhm.
probably, maybe they're whatever, they might be fully sealed and conditioned, but in many cases are at least hybrid. But when you
Yeah,
think about it in the context of an office building, right, that
right.
I mean, how do we get out of that situation, right? I mean, a
Yeah,
fully sealed curtain wall, like
yeah.
completely built to in many cases built to sort of maximize the throughput of energy, because that was politically and economically desired in the 50s and 60s, right, to use more energy. I mean, it was
Mhm.
good. It was
Right,
economy. It was motion. It was capital. It was building up. It was growth. Right. Buildings as a kind of
right,
engine of growth over the post-war period. Were engines for processing petroleum. Right. I mean, we've
right.
been deeply kind of a part of this production of the kind of conditions that we currently live in.
I agree with all of that, and I'm sorry
Mhm.
to just keep quoting back
No,
lines
no, no,
for
no.
you from
Okay,
the
go
book,
for it. Yeah,
but
yeah.
speaking of that, and I think this gets to the question of comfort, and it also gets to questions about looking to the future, and I think that's the
Mm.
other kind of
Yeah, yeah.
message in the book, is that in studying this history, we can kind of rethink how we might approach the future, and you have this question about halfway through the book about can architecture induce habits that activate a different relationship to fossil fuels? And I think another way to say that in the context of
Mm.
this conversation is,
Yeah.
can architecture induce habits that activate a different relationship to comfort? And you
Hmm.
say
Hmm.
habits occur, at least in some instances, when it becomes so spatialized, instantiated, built, in a word, when it becomes architecture.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
love that.
yeah.
And I think
Mm.
one of the themes of this podcast is that design is ideologies made artifact. It's taking
Mm,
ways
mm,
of living,
mhm,
ways of seeing
mhm.
the world, and turning them
Yeah.
into reality, turning them into spaces, objects, messages. And so what I'm hearing when I read that is that where architects have given up on thinking about that, or maybe not given up, but have traded it for the engine, to the engineers, you're kind of making an argument that this still is the domain of the architect. And so what do you see as the future? How do you see kind of architecture and design starting to reframe these questions?
That it is a book of history that is mostly about the future, and it is that because, and in just sort of very simple ways, which is to say, architects should read this. I mean, I guess I am trying to sell my book, so that's okay. Yes, please read it.
Yeah, that's what
That's
we're
fair
here
enough.
for.
I'm allowed to do that. Yeah. Architects should read it, and they will, recognize a different sort of past, that I, hope is sort of presented in such a way that allows one to kind of situate oneself as a kind of, a trajectory to carry forward, right? That there's a robust kind
Mhm.
of body of evidence here that can help us to kind of rethink architecture's project in the world, right? And participate in that. I'm not pretending, this is some like sort of prophetic, far from it, but that it's
Right.
just a kind of opportunity to help us think about the relationships of pasts and futures, and in effect to really emphasize again, I mean, relative to the facade, and emphasize kind of architecture as this kind of interface, right, as this space of negotiation, right, as this place where
Hmm.
cultures and civilizations kind of express themselves, right? So, what do we want to express, right? I mean,
Right.
the Seagram's Tower is always in my mind, basically,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of sealed office tower of the mid-century period and its proliferation around the world. That is what our sort of cultural capital, if you will, was dedicated to corporate expansion and globalization and et cetera. I mean, this has been a huge kind of aspect of architectural production, not just in terms of like buildings produced, but in terms of a kind of pathway and a kind of industrial system and a building industry that was rooted in a set of
Hmm.
again, relative to the architects and engineers, relative to regulations and codes, and how you can. I mean, there was a fabulous period in the 70s when you couldn't build a building in many states in the Midwest during the oil crisis without kind of demonstrating access to alternative fuels. But in that
Mm.
case, natural gas was considered an alternative because it was local. It was not to
Mm.
be, didn't have, wasn't part of the political crisis, right? But
Hmm.
nonetheless, right, there was legislation that said,
Right.
look elsewhere. And so we have like, there's so many histories and stories and kind of ways of thinking through rethinking architecture, as again this kind of device of climatic adaptability, right, as this kind of way of interfacing between humans and climate, which of course we desperately need to rethink, right? So in
Right.
many ways, the book is just sort of a plea to architects again, and or kind of those in the broader kind of architectural public, let's say, designers and historians and people, and everybody who's interested, yeah, to kind of look at these issues and take on climate much more aggressively, right?
Right.
Which I again say
Right.
with many caveats of many fabulous colleagues who are doing so, but to turn the kind of discursive engine of the field towards these questions, basically. Um,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, you just said that architects should read this and that you want architects to read this, and I
yeah,
would
yeah.
even go a step further. Me as a graphic designer coming from a graphic design background, I
Mm,
actually would
mm,
make the argument that graphic designers should read this
yeah,
also.
yeah, sure.
Uh, because the other kind of big piece of this book is you write a lot about media and
Yeah.
images and how that helped disseminate these ideas. Can you talk about that kind of strand
Mm,
of it, and especially coming, thinking about this in an architecture context, can you talk about the role of media, and specifically what you mean when you say media kind of in the architecture context, and images here?
yeah, and I mean, I again, I mean too many things by that word, indeed, and use it, sort of milk what I can from it. But I mean, I think on the one hand, the sort of question of images, and there's a lot of the way that I really got to the book, in effect, was through thinking about how. Really being curious about how these Ogyai brothers, who I've mentioned already, these
Mhm,
Hungarian
mhm.
emigres, made all these just wacky images, right? That were,
Yeah,
these
yeah,
diagrams that were trying to kind of solve the problem of climate design, right? That were, I mean, brilliant and fabulous and researched and thorough. I mean, they're amazing research. I don't disparage them at all, but they were also just, they were trying to fit into us. There was just no kind of interface for them in
right.
architecture, in effect, relative to these questions of climate. So they just they appear so anachronistic, and so trying to understand the struggles of sort of using of how media, how diagramming, how the design process, was being seen as a place for thinking about climate, right? And so one
Mm.
of the sort of general frameworks of the book is that part of what we're tracing, looking at this kind of circa 30s to 60s period, um, is we're sort of uh, tracing the kind of emergence of a body of media that's grappling with the question of climate at a moment when that's
Right.
there's not a lot of. I mean, that's going on in many different interesting places, basically, in sort of piecemeal ways, and it transforms a lot over that period. So there's that sort of just sense of a kind of production, a kind of image making apparatus that So there's a great there's a chapter that looks at a project that happened in the 1940s into the early 1950s that was at both the American Institute of Architects and House Beautiful magazine, right?
Right.
So a kind of
Right.
shelter magazine of the period. I mean, still around, but um, uh, to look at how basically directed at architects through the AIA, and then directed at the I mean, frankly, housewives and their husbands, kind of placed in that language from House Beautiful,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
how to work with your architect to adjust your house to climate, how to build a building for the climate, this whole climate control project that was just this proliferation of media, right? And it was these,
Right.
I mean, models and photographs of buildings, of course, I mean, those kind of familiar representational, direct representational images, but then also the graphs and the charts for the architects, and sun path diagrams, and all these kind of wild, mostly opaque, really, in many ways, even
Yeah.
today. Although embedded in, I mean, this was also, of course, the beginning of performance software. I mean, this was the data
Mhm.
gathering and the kind of
Right.
managing of inputs to eventually come to now what we have kind of built into many softwares, performance
Yeah.
softwares. Um, so yeah, media become, and of course I talk about the facade as media as well, and sort of play
Right.
that out, and really in the sense of being a kind of interface, right? And thinking then about the reason I overplay this term media is because when you think about the facade of a building and the kind of way it's constructed and the way that climate is imagined to relate to it, and you also think about the sorts of drawings and ideas that are going on in the architectural field around climate and its how to estimate it, how to work with it, how to model according to it, right? You just get this really rich perspective and kind of perception, and access to a really rich kind of body of knowledge about how climate buildings become a way of kind of living with different climates, right? And have
Yeah.
always been,
Yeah.
of course, right? I mean, again, this is
Yeah.
kind of recapturing the pre-modern, I mean, often quite explicitly, way of living, right?
Right.
Yeah, so media becomes important there too.
Yeah, you have this great line. Weather can be experienced. We need media to understand climate.
Mm,
Building can be experienced. We need media to understand architecture. And I
right.
loved that, and I loved the House Beautiful section because as a graphic designer, that actually felt the closest to my work. And so
Mm.
much of that kind of messaging and those diagrams could also be read as graphic design,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and
No,
and I,
absolutely.
I think that's where it really starts to expand beyond not just the built world, but how we talk about the built world.
Right, right, right. And then I mean, there was a sort of there were versions of that chapter that went off into lots of uh, you know pathways,
I bet.
and one of them has to do with just just the intensity of some of those diagrams, and why the diagram. I mean, so there's a diagram that shows that's a collaboration between a meteorologist and an architect, that this is kind of where to place your house on a hill, and it has the kind of wind
Right.
swooping in and around, and it's just so beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just this rich kind of expressive, and the colors are amazing, and it's just such an amazing aesthetic object. And so I got really fascinated about how that kind of need to sort of capture that kind of affect,
Mm,
and sort of cultivate that desire, right, became a sort of project for image making and media making, at the same time as the sort of gathering of data, right, and kind of how to and again, the old guys, I think, express that in part because they kind of fumble with it, and they're over ambitious, and they have some trouble with it. But there's these a few moments that sort of pop up in the book where, and from the old guys' work as well, where you just kind of see it kind of there's a when the old guys come up with this concept of the comfort zone as their kind of,
right.
I mean, they adopt it. I mean, it's kind of it becomes kind of a everyday concept quite quickly, but in terms of the industry. Um, uh, but they sort of play it out in so many different ways. But one of them is this kind of technical drawing, on a XY axis, kind of showing temperature and humidity and these various kind of hazardous climate conditions, right, that the
Mm,
building is to protect you from,
hmm.
and then showing inside this kind of cloud, this kind of bubble, a reclining figure. I mean, on a
Yeah.
Corbusian chaise, in fact, smoking a pipe and reading the newspaper, and and again, this is where, I mean, I know I'm going on here for a second, but this is also where also where the kind of aspects of equity and racial justice, and the extent to which these kind of House Beautiful projects were managing climate in the suburbs were explicitly exclusive and exclusionary. And that even this whole premise, the sort of broader questions of, as I bounce around a little bit in projects in West Africa and um, parts of Asia and the Middle East, especially U.S. embassy projects in the 50s, just a recognition at how much the this kind of argument for modern architecture as a climatic apparatus is also a way to describe the kind of ways in which architecture was a part of kind of interventionist efforts, either colonial
Right.
or neo-colonial or quasi-diplomatic, right through this embassy building, or like I talked briefly and have been writing a bit more about a book designed by, a building designed by Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew in Lagos,
Mm,
Nigeria in 1960, the headquarters of British Petroleum.
mm,
That is a shaded building, right, and that has a hybrid system, and that is kind of able to be there and support its northern western corporate
yeah.
executives because of its shaded system, right, so that it can extract more oil, from Nigeria to send
Right.
elsewhere. So it's just the
Oh,
integration
that's
of,
interesting.
when we talk about kind of modern architecture, let's say relying on a climatic adaptability, it's not just a kind of narrative of technological design prowess, right? It's also, kind of a way of understanding the deep
Yeah.
interconnections between colonialism and its kind of aftermath and the modern architectural project, right? I mean, the technological efficiencies, and certainly the rendering livable, difficult climates, right? I mean, the kind of role of these buildings around the world. But by these buildings, I mean shaded buildings that are kind of entering into a landscape in order to sort of produce a type of thermal space that is comfortable according to a certain universal standard, right? I mean, these are kind of projects of sort of techniques of colonization, in effect, right? I mean, what be they corporate or governmental, or internal, for that matter, right? In the case of Brazil, um, so we don't want to lose sight of that. Yeah.
And that leads into what my next question was, which I was kind of curious. I mean, obviously this book just came out recently, but I'm curious what's next. What are you thinking about? What's kind of the next project? And I think, you started talking about some stuff you're writing now, but where are your interests headed?
Yeah, no. So I have two projects going on, and they're kind of one, I guess, is a bit more sort of richly focused on the discipline and kind of an architectural history
Mm,
book, and it's called Stranded Assets, and it's basically trying to
mm,
understand, indeed, some of the books I've mentioned, the Seagram's Tower, also the Bauhaus,
mhm.
Dessau building, and a number of other
Oh,
kind of
right.
icons. Just kind of read them as carbon, as carbon processors again, right? As kind of ways
Yeah.
of understanding transformations in the energy system, and also read them as intensifiers in effect of energy use. So a sort of story of
Mm.
architecture and carbon.
Oh, that's
But then
interesting.
I'm so that's the kind of again, architectural historical narrative familiar to the field, and then I'm also in effect trying to take some of the things we've been discussing and the kind of people conditioning ideas, uh, some of the kind of points of the modern architecture and climate book that are more kind of broadly relatable. Let's say I'm trying to kind of produce a more sort of public version, if you will. I mean, it's not a version of
Oh,
the book at all, but
interesting.
it's a version of this discussion around architecture and climate,
Yeah.
that can, be a part of a different kind of discourse. So that's kind of based more on
Oh, that's
interviews with other experts, and kind of talking through the challenges, and a bit more kind of conversational, and still figuring it out. But that's the other direction
That's
right
a
now. Yeah.
I mean, that's a great I love that idea. I can't wait. I mean, I will definitely get that book when it's ready because I think we're talking about it as designers. We're talking about it through the lens of
Mm.
architecture, and the book is so clearly using architecture as a way to talk about things that are not necessarily architecture.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. Fair
book
enough.
does
Yeah.
go into so many different ways of thinking about climate and the environment that I think it makes a lot of sense to
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Mm.
produce a version of that that's I don't know the word, more accessible to people outside of the field,
Mm.
um,
Mm. Mm.
uh,
Yeah, I
or,
think there's a
or more
lot. There's
approachable, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, and it's to enter that discussion and to kind of share some of the knowledge, and hopefully to
Mhm.
reveal a lot of other people's research as well. But and again, to try to kind of keep it on. I mean, it's absurd that we need to keep kind of begging people to pay attention to climate too, right? But here we
Yeah.
are. So
Yeah.
we do what we need to do.
My last question, and this is a question I used to end all of these conversations. And speaking of books, it's a perfect way to end it. What are you reading right now?
That's a good one. Yeah. What am I reading right now? I'm reading. I read a lot of science fiction, so I'm actually reading.
Somehow
I'm
that
reading,
doesn't surprise me. Actually, I mean, we don't know each other, but that seems right.
I'm reading a book of short stories that is called After the Apocalypse. I don't even remember who the editor is, but it's a great collection. I read a lot of Afrofuturism fiction, and Tate
Oh, nice.
Thompson's Rosewater series is I don't know. I tend to cycle through it once a year these days, and I think it's a great body of work. But I'm also reading. I've just been reading Joy Knoblauch's book. I break into my office to get the exact title, but it's occupied. It's a kind of architecture of good behavior. It's about a kind of story of architecture and psychology in the 50s and 60s, and defensible space and the kind of integration of architectural ideas into, in a way, similar, kind of things that are so evident to us now in some ways in terms of their extreme versions in incarceration and other places, but that she teases out in very delicate and intricate histories. I just got André Siake's new book. André Siake is an architect at Columbia, about his Powers of 10 project that is just one of these kind of thick, rich volumes that I'm really looking forward to diving into.
Nice.
So,
that's a great list. That's a really good. That's a great reading list, actually. Daniel, thanks so much for doing this. This was such a fun conversation. I loved the book. I thought it was so interesting, and I thought this conversation was so great. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. I really appreciate your engagement with the material. It's always great fun to talk about. And so thanks for all the great questions. Basically, it was a lot of fun.
This episode was recorded on November 20th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.